Welcome back to Sex and Censorship. This is Jerry Barnett. This episode is about race and racism, which are subjects close to my heart. I'm in discussion with Courtney Hamilton, a black Londoner who, like me, has a background in left-wing activism and, like me, has become increasingly worried about the direction of the so-called anti-racism movement. Courtney writes about troublesome and divisive issues like false racism accusations and the strange bullying idea of, quotes, cultural appropriation. By the way, if you like this content and would like it more often and with better production standards, please support my campaign for liberal values by going to patreon.com/Jerry Barnett. You can also find me on Twitter at Porn Panic, and on Facebook the page is Sex and Censorship. Now on with the show.
I'm Courtney Hamilton, and my main interest has been photography. That's where I essentially come from. Graduated at London College of Printing back then. Like it's London College University of Communications. That's today in Elephant Castle. I'm born and bred in South London, and I'm a Millwall supporter, by the way. And
I was going to boo, but I'm not really a football fan, so I'm kind of.
And we happen to be
neutral on this subject.
And we happen to be sat in New Cross, so this is all familiar ground to me, where I was brought up. And but most recently, in the last couple of years now, I've been reading and writing on issues relating to race and more specifically anti-racism.
Yeah.
And the course that it seems to be taking at the moment. So for me, every day I go into Google, punch racism, and literally see what comes up. I've been doing that.
It's fascinating. Yeah,
every day for the last 2 years.
I've got some Google alerts set up on things, so my mail gets bombarded with stuff that it's almost kind of self-punishment, isn't it? What's going to wind me up today? Can I mean, your own background and get based on your age and location and stuff, and you're one of the infamous children of the Windrush generation.
Well, yeah, I was discussing this with a PhD writer yesterday about even the whole sort of concept of the word Windrush.
Yeah.
Because at the moment that seems to when people think about Windrush, they think about obviously the ship, and they think about people who arrived between 1962 and sometime before sort of 1971. But
the Windrush arrived in 1948.
48, sorry, that's right, 1948.
So that was the first
influx
of black people into the UK.
Well, 200 or so people.
Well, not that
But yeah, it's funny because a lot of people were making a big fuss at the time.
A lot of ships did follow that.
Yeah, that's right.
The next 20 years or so.
But there was, in fact, a wave of post-war migration from the colonies, especially from the Caribbean, into the UK, and many came on ships because obviously that's the cheapest way of getting from the Caribbean to there. So obviously the second generation that are here in the UK today would be my parents could be said to be of the children of the they are the Windrush generation.
So your parents migrated?
My parents migrated from Jamaica
to
here. My father, he worked in Ford's just as a car plant engineer, and my mother was a nurse, and she worked in St Giles Hospital just up the road from here. It's a block of flats at the moment now, but that's another thing. And for me, they kind of represent what the Windrush generation is, and
So
yeah,
they're that
I see them.
stereotypical, aspirational, hardworking,
Indeed.
looking for a better life for their kids.
Yeah, indeed. Because, when you read back of what Jamaica was like, they came over. In fact, my father came over it would have been 63, and my mother in 64. And then, my sister was born after that, and then after they got settled and in Lewisham. And that's when they started their family. But when you look back at in the early 60s in Jamaica, there wasn't anything there for them.
It's a poor country.
There was literally nothing there for them, and they managed to scrape together some money for the fare to get over here, and they haven't really looked back kind of since. But I think what is really important as well for me as well, knowing that they really had something going for them. They really wanted to sort of reach out and make a new life, and they knew they could do it.
Yeah.
And they they had the gumption and just the proverbial balls to do it.
It's basically one of the reasons why immigration is generally good, because you typically get the more driven, the smarter, the hardworking people.
Indeed.
And they tend to leave their kind of lazier cousins behind.
Well, it seemed that was the way. These my aunts and my uncles, they did exactly the same thing. They looked at what was going on in their own countries, in the parts of the Caribbean, and it was a complete, an utter mess back in the 60s. Downtown sort of Kingston, was poverty stricken, and there wasn't much scope for, sort of having a decent life, or even aspiring to have a decent life for yourself, let alone for your children back then. So it was a no-brainer, sort of, for
I think my introduction to all that was, I kind of grew up, in Wembley, which is out, slightly. It was a suburb then. It's kind of more in London now, but it's just on the cusp. And then in 1976, my family moved to Kensal Rise, and I went to secondary school. And suddenly I was one of 4 white kids, and so most of the kids were West Indian, and I was immersed in this culture that I've always loved. I love to this day, but it's far more, it's fascinating and interesting. It got me involved in anti-racism, but it also gave me a very different perspective on things from a lot of other kind of white people, or a lot of people who are now on the left. So yeah, to an extent, I think it made me see life in a very different way. That at the time, for sure, I wanted to stand up against police harassment, the National Front, the threats to black people. At the same time, realizing that what you're fighting for is equality, and that throughout my school days and that kind of thing, I had to assert myself. I was in, Jamaica is such a proud culture. This wasn't, these people, like the people I grew up with, didn't see themselves as victims or oppressed or whatever. They saw themselves as kings of the earth. That's kind of, to me, that's the Jamaican attitude. And
they were pretty fearless. That's right. They had a very fearless kind of attitude, and I think.
Jamaica is such a powerful culture. Like nowhere else on earth has created so much culture. But
probably Ireland.
I don't know.
Again, another country with another sense of itself, and a sense of
a diaspora country.
Yeah, a country that's spread out, across the world, and also another. A country that has a real sort of proud sense of itself, but also a real fighting notion about itself. That it's not prepared, to be kind of treated, sort of like something you scrape off your bottom of your shoe without consequences.
And you see that in people's individual characters, and certainly, I think, you certainly see it with Jamaicans, and like I say, the people this idea today of oppression and of white supremacy and hierarchy, that the anti-racism movement talks about. I never got that. To me, as a white person in a minority in a Jamaican culture, it was very much my job to fit in but also to assert myself and to assert my rights to be an equal. And much as I was an anti-racist campaigner and was disgusted by how the police were acting at the time, I had to every day assert, my rights to be an equal with the people I was surrounded by.
I think for me, growing up, especially in South London, a lot of that was kind of given in a way with a lot of the people that I kind of knew and grew up with. That everyone had kind of got used to the fact that the post-war migration of Caribbeans, they were here to stay. There was nothing, they had children that had gone to school with, they had friends with, the integration side of that kind of that post-war immigration was, to all intents and purposes, a very successful thing.
I agree, and actually I think that's something that needs to be rammed down people's throats today, because some people are almost insisting on becoming victims again. And I mean, or comparing us to the American situation, which is very different. But by the time like I say, 1976, I became immersed in it, black and white working class cultures had already kind of melded together and fused together, and there was a lot of mutual respect.
Especially when the two-tone thing came about, it was a very natural, organic kind of multiculturalism that was emerging in the UK at that time. And sort of the two-tone movement was kind of an expression of that kind of just a natural coming together of kind of this white kind of working class culture as well as black working class culture in the same kind of pot, in this like melting pot, and it just seemed a very sort of natural natural thing that was happening in Britain. But that actually is very specific to this country. I don't think other countries, especially in Europe, went through the same process. I don't see an
equivalent anywhere in Europe, and
that's why I always
in the United States.
Yeah, that's why I always say it's what's happened. The history of what has happened in Britain in the last 40 years is very specific to Britain. You can't compare Britain to, say, what's going on in France. Obviously, there are similarities. There are certain, sort of similarities, but culturally, socially, and politically, it kind of developed and it emerged its own distinct kind of character.
I think that I've seen that, and I think sometimes I get increasingly upset, and I think you do, about almost a slandering of white British people.
Yeah, I do. That really bugs me. Like I say, every day I go onto Google and I sort of press racism, and then all I seem to find the majority of the cases these days is that there's this kind of call out culture of kind of of calling people out and calling them racist. And so you kind of let's get into the meats and bones of this specific allegation, only to find out that it wasn't the case. And that's what I seem to be finding out more and more. It's actually says people who kind of are kind of so quick to use the word racialist, racist, seem to be becoming more and more of a problem than actual racism itself on black people. I mean, that's what I'm used as an excuse
for. I'm not going to use the term reverse racism because
I don't like that term either.
But it gets used as an excuse to bully people. So actually,
But there's power in it now.
Power.
I think
so yeah,
people have
it's
learned, in fact, that there is power now in accusing people of racism. In the same sense that ideas come over from America, where now, corporations and institutions are completely terrified of being accused of being racist
on the stupidest, on the dumbest of grounds. I mean, over the last couple of years, because I track it as well. There was the Dove ad, where, which wasn't very. Because I've got so many
the one
black
with the
friends
girls that changed,
they're
morphed.
taking their skin off.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
they're changing their skin like clothing. And actually, if you look at the ad, it's kind of a black girl turning into a white girl, turning into an Indian girl, it's a kind of very humanist, anti-racist kind of message. But because I have so many kind of black activist friends on Facebook, I watch these things evolve hour by hour. So I mean, that one in particular was. The first thing was that someone extracted 4 screenshots from the video and shared them on Facebook. So before anyone had seen the video, they'd seen these 4 screenshots that made it look kind of like a black woman was turning into a white woman. And then everyone got really angry, and then everyone started, and it's kind of, and then it's like, will this never end? Will the oppression never end? And you're talking about people in London who are trying to imagine themselves as 1950s Alabamans or something, like.
I think you've hit the nail right on the head there. It's somehow people in the year 2018, sort of having, as if they've kind of walked out of a Black Panther meeting of 1962 and, sort of watch a Heineken advert or watch a Dove advert, and they're applying that kind of idea that that there is kind of this oppression around.
Oppression is kind of people
it's a strong word.
People love wearing oppression these days. I think I pointed out in my book, oppression used to be something people didn't want, and now it's something people do want. It's like
it is kind of it's almost fashionable to a certain extent. I kind of think of the people like Afua Hirsch, who kind of revels in it in a sense. She loves it. It kind of for her it's almost an identity. This whole idea that she somehow
she's a middle class Guardian journalist,
precisely
one of the aren't as privileged as you can get in global terms, and
but for her,
my skin is brown.
The trauma
down to me,
Yeah, but for her,
she's from.
She's from Wimbledon.
The Badlands of South.
The ghettos.
but yeah, it's. I mean, a lot of it is middle class people suddenly finding oppression, this power, as you say, but they wouldn't have it without these like incredibly annoying white middle class people who have decided to say sorry for stuff that never happened, or that
who are sucking it up, basically.
Who are because they're the ones kind of saying sorry, and they're the ones telling other white people, "Shut up! You've got to let this woman talk because she's black," and
Well, she realises as well, I suppose, maybe subconsciously, that when she's running around sort of kicking at these doors, actually they fly open. Yeah. They're not like the doors where we used to kick down, sort of back in the mid '80s in order, against the SPG, the Special Police Group, and this is not that kind of a society that we're living in at the moment. Where if you really wanted justice, you would have to scream and shout and fight.
The 1981 riots were not. Were not privileged, entitled brats kicking off. These were people who were getting beaten up by the police and
that literally had nothing to lose.
And again in 1985, I think in Tottenham, there was you had to have massive sympathy, even if there were thugs out taking advantage of it. You had to have massive sympathy for what drove people to it. But it's something markedly changed, and I only woke up to this, I think, later than you. Sometime between the early 80s and the 2000s, something changed where the conditions of the old racism went away, and yet, and the more it went away, the more people started wanting to hold on to it. And then there's this flip into identity politics, which was very recent, like post 2010, where suddenly people are trying to resurrect stuff and wear it as a badge of pride or a badge. And what do you think changed in that 30 years or so?
Well, I think it was the emergence, the real kind of grip that identity politics seemed to be having on the outlook of a new emerging kind of anti-racism during that time. And it did seem to me, because that was actually the reason why I actually started writing, because before then I hadn't been writing anything at all. But it just seemed to me there were now, people were getting, really great white kind of anti-racist writers were in the face of kind of this kind of new emerging kind of almost hysterical identity politics, decided it's not worth it. It's not worth
and that's,
me.
A lot of white people are too scared to speak up in this climate.
And it's a real shame, because
I'm talking about white anti-racist, progressive people.
Yeah, exactly, and I think it's a real shame, and I kind of noticed this as well. That a lot of them weren't prepared to just take this kind of hostility from people who were saying, "Who are you to talk about racism? When you're white." Even though they've been reading some of the most seminal texts in sort of anti-racist thought for the last kind of 50 years. These are real experts in their field, because
and suddenly middle class student 21 knows more because they happen to be brown,
just because of their biological makeup, But the thing was as well, there was a torrent of this kind of abuse, being fielded at sort of great sort of white anti-racist thinkers, and I just gradually saw them one after another kind of retreating from that area and leaving the area of anti-racism and the writing to these kind of identitarians.
Yeah, and I see identitarianism, if you like, as exactly what we fought against in the 80s. So, the National Front was identity politics. They wanted to define people by skin colour and separate people. So, I guess I'm one of the few people that doesn't back down, but it gets really tiring sometimes, because I've been unfriended by a lot of people, I've faced abuse by a lot of people, but the reason I don't is probably because I spent 7 years at school with a bunch of Jamaicans, having to assert myself on a daily basis, and I'm used to it. It's like I've never been ashamed to be white, whereas that's what some people want you to be. And I wrote this blog post in 2011, 12-ish, called "I Never Left the Left Left Me." This was my waking up moment, which was basically saying I haven't shifted in 35 years on my anti-racism principles, but suddenly the left has become racist and is trying to define me as a racist, and I'm not going to accept it. I'm going to have to stand my ground, and it's
and so you should. But yeah, it's going to be a long kind of I wouldn't like to say battle, but it's going to be a very long process because I find myself having to think of kind of new and interesting ways in order to kind of combat those ideas that are becoming much more prevalent amongst a new emerging kind of student base that seems to be coming up and being quite influential. They're the ones that are getting the the opinion pieces in the Guardian and in the Telegraph, because they seem to be saying the kind of things that seem to be acceptable and that won't be found to be too offensive. That's why you could have someone like what's that? Transsexuals who just recently joined Berghoff, Monroe.
Yeah,
Berghoff.
Yeah,
that's why you can have someone like
so that's
her who could
transgender woman.
yeah.
So,
but I mean, that's what we live in now, in a kind of climate where someone like that who can, sort of have such a race orientated kind of colour of skin kind of view of the world.
So she made some anti-white
statements. Basically she's saying, all white people are racist until they, proven otherwise, basically. But you can have the rise of someone like that in this type of climate. I think mainly because, one, there isn't that many people who are, that willing to, sort of argue against her, point by point. And then secondly, there's a whole that some of her ideas are very popular at the moment. To view the world through the prism of race,
not just view it, but use it as a stick to beat people with. So I mean, so part of this is just basic human witch hunting kind of instinct, isn't it? Like here's a group that looks weakened. Let's go for the jugular.
And getting weaker. But as well as that, they're helped by a climate of this offence taking as well, which we've got hate speech laws at the moment now, which really, in a way, silences many people, who don't want to fall foul of hate speech laws. They don't want to be accused of being a racist, because we know what happens if you are publicly accused of this.
A few years ago it meant you were going to be destroyed on Twitter. Now it could mean you go to prison.
And worse, basically, if that kind of label that
your
career
racist
finished, you could end up being, what's his name, Spencer, punched in the face, just standing on the street corner doing an interview, minding your own business. I think, it can be worse. And people are generally absolutely terrified of that kind of climate that we live in at the moment now, which does give these, sort of Berghoffs and Afuas the kind of space and scope to come out with kind of some completely outrageous, sort of suggestions at the moment. And I think for me, that's why I kind of wanted to, which, luckily Spiked, published my my stuff, and I was, really kind of happy that they were doing it, because there wasn't many people who were actually being very critical of this kind of emerging kind of climate.
Spiked reviewed my book. Spiked is one of those, it's very Marmite type thing. I mean, I agree with a fair bit of what they say, and then sometimes strongly disagree, but at least they're willing to give they're standing against the tide
an airing. And they're not afraid, basically, of sort of causing offence. Basically,
and it's not just fear. I think there's almost this fascism, and I call it that sometimes. That's gripped hold of publications that I used to be a Guardianista to the core, and I used to love the Guardian, and just sometimes the hate that comes out of the Guardian. It's not just fear; it's actually that they've been taken over by these hateful people. And
maybe you might be reading a lot of the opinion pieces where they have, they basically have almost like a blank check of, sort of.
But it's, the Guardian, I documented more from the point of view of feminism than the racial politics in my book. But it's there's. And again, it's interesting that there's a strong parallel between the feminist movement and the black activist, black nationalist movement.
But there is, because what occurred to me, I was reading James Hartfield's Equal Opportunities Revolution, his new book recently, and one of the sort of in the introduction, what really struck me was he was trying to argue that the last kind of 40 years, at the beginning, the left used to win people over by sort of arguing, you weren't going to be able to get, sort of black rights and equality and fight against discrimination under capitalism. And you weren't going to be able to attain women's rights, under capitalism, lesbian and gay rights, and so on and so forth. But kind of 40 years later, after all these introduction of, equality laws and anti-discriminatory laws,
it was kind of.
seems to actually.
Wrong. Yeah, I was in politics in the 80s,
but it all seems to have actually happened under capitalism.
It's one of the things that made me drift away from Marxism. That and not to mention poverty reduction and stuff like that.
Exactly.
And everything that wasn't going to happen under capitalism has happened.
Seems to actually has happened under capitalism. So it's been a great dichotomy for the left. That have spent so much time and energy preaching that kind of idea. That I found it that whole notion kind of fascinating, because it also explains that the great kind of loss in the left's influence over the years as well, because it hasn't been able to change and adapt, and it's found that a lot of its ground has kind of shifted and moved.
Yeah, and I think there's a decline in intellectualism. One of the things I loved about being
where
in
have
the
they
left,
gone?
In the early 80s, there were some incredibly smart people. I used to love going to conferences and hearing these really clever people from all over the world. Intellectual giants who were on the left, and there aren't any intellectual giants on the left, or I'm missing them.
Indeed, and great anti-racist thinkers as well. I asked someone the other day, name me kind of 2 or 3 of the great anti-racist thinkers of today. Let's
say Afua Hirsch.
It's a big and ahhing. That's all I did. Afua Hirsch wasn't even mentioned. It's like she's really specialist kind of knowledge.
But I don't know if there are anti-racist thinkers. It's all. There are many things that happened. One of the things that's happened is that anti-racism, having been accepted as a valid movement in the 70s and 80s, has now become an industry. Some people refer to this kind of thing as the grievance industry. So the more that you can build the grievance, the bigger the grants, the bigger the paychecks, the bigger the book deals.
That's right. There does seem to be that section. But in terms of what I was thinking, who are the great anti-racist thinkers, I asked that in the same vein as Martin Luther King. He was. Who are the great anti-racist thinkers of that stature?
Or if you
today,
broaden it even more, like who are the thinkers, full stop, of that stature?
Well, for me, I think there are the thinkers out there.
But are they on the left?
But they're very few, far between. They're not as many, as the great giant thinkers that emerged, post-war. The living Marx and
Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and also in the arts fields, Bob Marley and Fela Kuti were both giants, political giants. They weren't just great musicians. But to an extent, I think they were fighting against real stuff, and the left today fights against imaginary stuff. And maybe you don't need to be an intellectual giant to
do that. I think you're right.
Stuff.
Definitely, I think you've hit the nail on the head. The stuff that they're fighting about today, getting kicked out of Starbucks, or screaming about white girls, having dreadlocks, or
I wanted to talk about cultural appropriation in a sec, and all
that. This is a kind of stuff that people are screaming, and the anti-racists are kind of
I
screaming
keep making
about.
the point to people.
These
If this
days.
is what makes you most angry, then you haven't got much to complain about,
Then,
really, have you?
Yeah, that's right. If this is anti-racism, then leave me out. To get a paraphrase Grace Jones. So if this is anti-racism, please just come on, baby, leave me out. Basically,
I think. We were talking before we started recording about a big protest in the early 90s.
Yeah,
So
that was my first experience of going on an anti-racist demonstration. And
it's interesting because, if I could just set the scene with
Sure.
the way I saw it, because you and I think we've converged from different places on ideas, but I mean, that was probably the millionth anti-racism protest I've been on. I've been going on them since 1979, and I'd be all the way, especially the late 70s, early 80s, when the National Front were really big. We had huge anti-racism protests, and they were, all races united, and it was black and white, unite and fight, smash the National Front.
Yeah.
That was the thing.
That's right.
And then it kind of fizzled out because the National Front fizzled out. And then in the 90s, the BNP turned up, and we thought, oh no, it's the National Front all over again. And in hindsight, that threat had gone, and it was gone for good, and they couldn't really be resurrected. But so there was the BNP opened a bookshop in Eltham, so East London. It wasn't really my neck of the
South
woods.
London. It's just up the road,
Okay,
really.
so I've only been here 4 years. I'm a West Londoner, but so it's like, and all of us that have been on marches suddenly went, "It's back! We've got to go and fight." So there was this. They opened a bookshop, and we said, everyone was saying, no, it's not a bookshop, it's their headquarters, and we had to close it down. And
That's right.
we kind of went in there with this rage that how dare we beat you guys out 10 years ago, and now you've come back. And we were on this massive protest, and the police closed the road, because otherwise, literally, that building would have been torn down.
Yeah, would have done.
And then there was a riot, and we were charged up by mounted police, and I'm a bit of a chicken, so I stayed back a bit. But it felt like, at the time, it was like we've gone backwards. All the old far right anti-racism is coming back, which in hindsight it never did. The BNP never made the mark that we thought, that everyone thought. But yeah, I'd be interested in your perspective, because you were on that protest.
Yeah, that was, for me, that was my first major kind of intervention going into anti-racist politics, and I went as a part of a contingent of Workers Against Racism, East London Workers Against Racism. We went over there, but we were selling kind of our sort of East Workers Against Racism. They had a little magazine, but we was also selling Living Marxism at the time, so we kind of do it in both. But the main arguments we were using when we were up there is that, hey, it's okay, to not like these guys, but please, you cannot tell the police to shut down their bookshop because it's censorship. Yeah, you don't need to, invite the police to shut down a bookshop because you find it offensive. Yeah, because what will happen is that if you give the police that power, guess whose bookshop they're going to be coming down and shutting next?
Yeah.
Because somebody found it offensive.
So don't give the state the power.
Don't give them that power.
Yeah.
And that's why we kind of opposed that demonstration. We don't oppose people going out on demonstration and demonstrating against racism, but that specific demonstration was aimed at closing down this bookshop. And I kind of understood the importance of that, because we had a bookshop just recently up in Camden, and it campaigned against militarism, but it sold kind of books and magazines from all over the left kind of spectrum, and kind of invited people from all over the left to come down and to have meetings there and all the rest of that. But again, people in Camden were finding this little bookshop kind of and its material kind of offensive, especially he didn't like the victory to Iraq poster that used to be in there, victory to Iraq, who are these people, which at the time was a kind of very extreme kind of position that the RCP took on
and it's,
the
I mean,
Iraq
it's
War.
the point, it's one of the core central points about censorship is that, you know, to have censorship you need censors, and you have to trust those people with your freedom, basically. And it's, you know, even it's one of the arguments why you can't censor stuff.
And that the state was just completely untrustworthy with that kind of freedom. But obviously we were trying to use different type of arguments to try and explain that you know, it was really a bad idea to give the state this kind of power. You know, the reason why the state hasn't closed it down now is because no one's asking it to. In fact, what we're having now is anti-racists are inviting the police to shut down, you know, what you see as offensive, and, you know, sort of it's offending your sensibilities. So therefore, the police should have the power, you know, to close it down. This is completely has nothing to do with anti-racism, but it's more to do, you know, with endowing the state, which you already argue that does not act in the interests of, you know, sort of ordinary black white people. You're endowing them with more power that will actually end up coming down on your head, you know, if not, you know, today at some point I think it's, in the future.
It's power, and it's people flexing their muscles, and it's also the fact that maybe the left is, you know, the establishment and the left have kind of merged over the last 30 years. So, you know, the left trusts the establishment to close down racists and to close down sexists and transphobes and homophobes and whatever, because the establishment is kind of, you know, and the left have kind of merged. And
yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you. You know, especially because you always wonder year after year, what is it about the state that the left love about it so much? Because, you know, even this week we've heard, you know, that the state kind of you know, sort of wantonly kind of destroyed these kind of you know, it doesn't matter whether if it's Conservative or it's the Labour, but it was the state thought it was okay to just tear up these landing cards without, you know, kind of digitising them or anything, you know, and putting them in
the
archives.
Windrush thing, which is, I mean, that's one of those interesting situations where, on the one hand, all of my kind of black activist friends have, you know, jumped on it, and it's instantly, definitely racism, definitely they want to deport all black people, and all of that kind of thing. So that, on the one hand, on the other hand, no one's actually supporting this measure. It's like somewhere between one. It's either complete government incompetence or it's extreme racism. And I err towards incompetence, even though there could be a dose of racism.
I don't think it is. I think, like you say, it's more to do with, you know, just the state in itself. You know, the state, you know, really kind of, you know, it lacks authority as well at the moment now, and it's just continually proving itself to be incompetent. It really cannot cope with the new demands that is, you know, that is having on being put on it by people. So you have, you know, in this 1 week, the state, you know, we find out the state has done this in the past, but also in the same week we find out the state has been kicking down Cliff Richard's door, you know, for what, you know, apparently, you know, that's going to blow up this week, you know, and what else, and at the weekend it bombs, you know, kind of just bombs a third world country for, you know, it says for humanitarian reasons. And, you know, this all happened in the space of 1 week. And it really does make you think, you know, come on, the left, what is it about the state that really kind of enamors you to it? I think it does make me wonder.
It's also because, I mean, the state's become politically correct, and that's not just the Labour parts of it, that's the Tory parts as well. It's, there's in my book I note a story of a rapper, Tyler the Creator, a Californian rapper, who, when Theresa May was Home Secretary, she barred him from entering the UK. And Theresa May, British Home Secretaries like barring people from entering the UK. This guy was barred on the base after a feminist campaign on the basis that some of his lyrics were sexist and homophobic. So, you know, the state was perfect. I think the state's perfectly comfortable with political correctness because it's a perfect. It's just it's an excuse for authoritarianism. Maybe this is why the left is cheering on the state, because the state doesn't bar. As I said in the book, you can't bar black people anymore unless you can find that they've been sexist and homophobic, and then, you know, then you can bar black people.
Indeed. Oh, that's right. Beanie Man. I remember those. Like it was a decade ago when, you know, sort of Stonewall and the Peter Tatchell had their murder music kind of campaign against dancehall Jamaican music.
Yeah.
And you know, according to Tatchell and Stonewall, you know, they constantly invited the government to ban, you know, Beanie Man and all these Jamaican dancehall artists because their music had homophobic lyrics. And, you know, again, it's right, the Home Secretary said, oh, yeah, of course, I'll ban these people, definitely.
Yeah,
you know,
like,
horrible.
Great, we've got a way to ban Jamaicans and no one's going to complain about.
And get normally people who have been critical of state kind of authoritarian institutions to do it, you know, to ask them, to invite them to do it for them, you know, on their behalf. So, yeah, there is, you know, sort of a lot of contradictory, you know, at the moment, there's a lot of contradictory kind of attitudes the left have towards the state. And so, you know, in some cases, yeah, that's right, the state, they end up endowing the state with power and authority that they probably wouldn't have had.
I think, yeah, because I mean, back in the day, the kind of the hardcore edge of the left was anarchism, you know, which is like completely burn the state, and I guess those kind of tendencies are now on the right, that in the libertarian movement. So to an extent that bits of the right have taken over from what the left used to do, and bits of the left have taken over from what the right used to do. You know,
I think you might have a good point there. Yeah, you know, a lot of libertarians today would, you know, they just want the state to empty your dustbins, make sure the lights go on, and, you know, to do mundane things like that.
I'm sure you'll find libertarians that claim we don't need our dustbins emptied.
Someone's got to empty them, and the state's probably, you know, just about, you know, can handle, you know, that kind of, you know, business basically. But in terms of you know, what kind of libertarian politics should be about, it should be about kind of promoting a kind of self-sufficiency and self-responsibility in people, to the extent that, you know, that we don't want the state to kind of constantly interfere, you know, in political matters and you know, sort of cultural matters. Only, you know, if they're going to maybe, you know, sort of give some you know, a group some money, and that's it. But other than that, they, you know, they shouldn't have the right to be telling you, you know, what you can and can't say.
You know, this is why censorship is such a big thing for me, because it's not just the state, it's the state and the mob and universities and so on, but that's the ultimate power, when you can control the flow of information and of the message.
Yeah, and I think the state has been, you know, very good at adapting itself towards that. You know, it's very successfully got the hate speech laws, you know, sort of put through on the back that somehow the state was, you know, sort of defending black people, defending lesbian and gay people, defending women.
And of course the hate speech laws then will end up being used against
the very people.
Jamaicans, rappers, violent rappers.
Basically, you know, an ordinary sort of working class people, basically, at the end of the day.
There's an example I love of it, which is, do you know Reginald D. Hunter?
Yeah,
the comedian.
Right.
So he's a black American comedian, lives in London, and he had a comedy tour about a few years ago, which I went to, and he said he called it Pride, Prejudice and Niggers. That was the name of his tour, and it's like he said the name didn't mean anything. What he'd done was got drunk one night or stoned or whatever, and just sat there and gone through the name titles of books and just put the word and niggers on the end, So the one that made him laugh the most was like Pride, Prejudice and Niggers. So it's like, so that's what he called his tour. And it was a big West End show, and London Underground refused to carry his ads because they were racist. But it's like in order to defend black people, we have to censor black people. Especially this guy's from Alabama. He knows more about racism than most black people.
Yeah, I think that that's how this whole kind of sort of racism and anti-racism is being kind of turned kind of upside down at the moment. And that's why I kind of sort of find myself criticising sort of a lot of anti-racist campaigns and initiatives more so now than I used to do in the past, because yes, right, when you have kind of sort of Ofcom or sort of these state institutions kind of intervening on apparently on behalf of black people, because they say, oh, that advert, yes, it was a bit kind of sort of racist, and we're going to ban that advert because we find it racist and we don't want to offend black people. It's like I just feel calm down here. If I haven't got the right to not be offended by anything, so just let it.
So the standards set by the most easily offended. I make a similar point because I'm Jewish. I take that example. So I don't want that. Isn't the states now banned
the arbiter
Spurs fans from singing Yiddos? They can get arrested for singing.
That's right. Yeah.
Spurs are the Yids, and they've always been the Yids, and they chant Yiddos. It's not because they hate Jews, it's because that's their name, and that's what and it's. But the states now decided to ban them from chanting that, which makes them. That feeds into anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Now everyone thinks the Jews have just told the police what to do, and it's as a Jew, I want I'd much rather people happily chant Yiddos and have police go and tell people what to say. And and in general, I'd much rather, if someone's going to be anti-Semitic, I want to hear them and I want to speak to them because I want to exchange views with them. I don't want the police going in and telling them they can't say that because that offends me. But it's as you say, you're not allowed not to be offended. And as a black man, from my view of black politics at the moment, everyone's loving getting offended. So do you get a lot of shit from other black people as well?
Well, I do, because I get a lot of people kind of sort of messaging me. How many I've had that Malcolm X kind of speech on the what's the difference between the house nigger and the field nigger. I've had 3 people send me that video.
Uncle Tom, of course.
3 times this year. It's about 4 or 5 times last year. No commentary, just send me that. Which is obviously they're trying to say for some reason that I'm just. What is their main reason? I think that really their main reason is that I'm not towing the kind of line. Really, I'm not. Why won't you toe the line? That's another way of saying
because I brush up against the same people, but I'm white, so they can just call me a racist rather than an Uncle Tom or whatever. It's probably easier to be called a racist than Uncle Tom. I don't know.
Yeah, but for me, I think the people who are actually sending me this stuff, I think actually they're and for me they're the Uncle Toms. For me they're the real kind of the house niggers. They're the ones who actually look to the state constantly. They want reparations. People who want reparations for slavery. For me, they're the real ones that constantly looking at the state to kind of solve its problems. Give me money for the slavery that you put my ancestors in. For me, that's the very definition of a house nigger. Someone who constantly looks somewhere else for sort of salvation and for sort for where they get their power from.
That terminology comes from, so it's old slave terminology. So there was the well-behaved slaves who were allowed in the big house, and then the rest who were in the field.
That's right. Yeah,
and
yeah.
It's interesting because, like, today the big house is the Guardian, the Labour Party,
yeah.
So it's kind
the
of
state as well. Yeah, that's right.
Well, I mean, you mentioned Ofcom, which is a horrible sense of shit body. The CEO of Ofcom is a black woman because now, because it's got diversity rules, and she's deemed to represent other black people because, which is racist because because she's black. But yeah, the big house is no longer the slave owner. The big house is
that's right. There's big institutions, and for me, because it comes round every year, the 1st of August is Emancipation Day. Comes around every year, 1st of August. So there'll be a big demonstration. I already know this already. There'll be a big demonstration. Starting out in Brixton. And there'll be costumes, people will be dressed up as slaves and all this, and but the main thrust of their kind of their argument, of their protest, is to fight for reparations. They want reparations for slavery, for the slave trade that was abolished in the past. But
sure, and in terms of the British Caribbean, that's more than 200 years ago.
Right. So for me, that they want instead of saying, look, that's finished, that's past, let's kind of sort out the problems that we have today in the community. They're kind of, as I use that phrase, they're kind of stuck in this kind of we need the state to enable us and facilitate us, and it's constantly looking at the state to kind of
and it's also
what they need,
because like a lot of the black activists today, because about half the black British population are African immigrants, and a lot of the black activists today are kind of people of Nigerian background who their ancestors were selling slaves. They weren't, so it's kind of, this kind of upsets people if you point this out to them, but
I know. I did that with the Benin bronzes that are at currently sitting in the British Museum at the moment now, because there's a big debate about these antiquities being sent back to Africa. But in this particular case, which is kind of absurd, really, and it kind of actually highlights how absurd some of the arguments for reparations are, especially when it comes to these, priceless treasures now. That they were taken by the Royal Marines from a king who made his wealth from slavery, from selling slaves.
People like to forget this part of the slave story. It wasn't just white people buying slaves; it was Africans selling slaves. And
the funny thing was, as well, I don't know if you've been watching that program, Civilization, that's been on BBC Two recently, and the historian, the author of a black, I can't remember his name now. He was narrating it, and he was kind of he was narrating the Civilization show, and he was also talking about the Benin bronzes, but he really played down the fact that the palace where the Royal Marines kind of ransacked was built on the wealth of selling slaves to the Portuguese. He really, he kind of said, oh, and by the way, he sold slaves. Not many, but he kind of sold slaves. And you think, oh, hold on a minute, how can someone amass great wealth selling cotton?
They weren't selling cotton anyway.
Or selling, grain. That I just, I'm not buying that really.
The fact is that was the number one export from West Africa for a long time.
Yeah,
and
exactly. And for this historian to kind of downplay that, I thought that was really disingenuous of him at the time.
To me, that sums up the phrase, what's meant by the words political correctness, because there's historical correctness and there's political correctness, and sometimes you need to decide between the two. And it's, the very phrase political correctness suggests that you can make things correct, that you can take lies and make them true, and you can make truth and turn it into lies.
I tend to use that phrase historical illiteracy quite a lot these days, because
certainly I guess in Black history there's a lot of that. I mean, it's been written to make people happy, a lot of these stories.
Yeah, and there is a lot of different kind of histories, it seems, being kind of thrown at you. So it does, you do have to look at history and look at it very, very, very carefully, because obviously, there's a lot more to it, and a lot of it is very debatable.
A lot more nuanced than people like to think.
Exactly. Fascinating the subjects that they are. The complexities of history sometimes, really do need a lot of time and effort, to kind of to pick it apart, and I think, especially with this historian on that program Civilization, I think he, downplayed areas. I think he downplayed areas which didn't really run with his kind of narrative, and sort of upplayed areas, and made the most of kind of areas of history that kind of does run along with his narrative. And the narrative would be, Britain is a kind of colonialist country, and that kind of colonialist mindset and spirit is still in existence today, blah 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 blah, etc etc.
And unfortunately, I mean, that's not just that historian. I guess he might be fearful to tell truth, because that's what has happened in academia. That, I mean, people, if you tell truth that upsets people, professors are kind of boycotted and protested by their students, and people are fired for telling the truth. And African history isn't the nice clean thing that we'd like it to be. And if you're going to teach real African history, you're going to be called a racist.
It does seem that way at the moment now, especially if students or other lecturers find the material being spoken about in history, or it contradicts some of their own ideas about what happens in history. You could find yourself at the receiving end of sort of kind of hysterical kind of demonstrations, and a lot of professors and learned people, they're not really in this world to kind of take that kind of stick, from people. They're not really built. Yeah, they're not really built to constantly have to run the gauntlet just to get into work every day and all this. So you can't really blame them when they decide, that working in universities maybe might be for them these days.
I wanted to kind of bring it to. Related to that area, to cultural appropriation, which is something we're going to talk about. We've been talking for a while.
It's probably my forte at the moment.
It's one of those Google alert terms that I have to wind myself up, because this idea annoys me more than almost any other idea that's out there. And it's such a change around, because for a long time, again, I was close to black politics, anti-racism politics. There was this thing that black culture is being ignored, that black musicians aren't being signed up by record labels, not being played on the radio. And some of that was true. A lot of it was true. Some of it was borrowed from American civil rights language and stuff. But there was a lot of that. I was always into the reggae scene, and it was always so niche. I don't know how much of it was racist and how much of it was music companies thinking you can't sell that. But then gradually, bit by bit, black culture came into the mainstream, and then white people started loving it and adopting hip hop, garage, jungle, all of those, which are my kind of music, and then suddenly, so it was like, it's great that that problem's over now. You know, black people are now overrepresented in the culture, which is great to me because I love black music.
Yeah,
and stuff.
whereas in the past,
And
they
then
were
suddenly, like
underrepresented.
5 years ago, people started going, "Oh no, white people can't. You can't wear that. You can't do that because you're appropriating." So it's gone full circle. It's like first you're ignoring us, and now you're appropriating from us. And I find it. The first thing I thought when I heard the term cultural appropriation was of this. I'd seen this flyer. I think I've got it up here, but this is from which U.S. state? From Louisiana, and it says it's a 1960s flyer. It says, "Help save the youth of America. Don't buy Negro records. If you don't want to serve Negroes in your place of business, then do not have Negro records on your jukebox or listen to them." And basically, you know, it says this stuff's undermining the morals of our white youth in America. And it's almost like the left has almost seized on this same idea, like white people leave that stuff alone, unless somehow whoever runs the black community gives you permission to. You know.
Well, I think with that poster there, it's written with, you know, like you say, with this kind of race identity kind of perspective in mind.
This is from 1965,
yeah,
I think.
And obviously white race, white perspective, which had a lot of purchase in American society at that time. And, you know, it wouldn't be, you know, far amiss that would have been in the heart of, you know, the Jim Crow era. So it wouldn't, you know, no one would be shocked at all to see that sort of thing. But in terms of, yeah, you're right. What we see today now, especially, as you say, in the last kind of 5 years now, again, I think this rise of criticising cultural appropriation is also corresponds with the rise of identity politics as well. And identitarians kind of using having a much more racialized view of culture in and of itself, you know, and the idea of who owns culture has become kind of the question of it has become racialized to that extent. So if you cannot win an argument with someone on who owns, say, something like jazz music, if you want to argue about it in terms of racialism, in terms of race, you will always lose that argument. So what I tend to do is talk about what culture is and what it's supposed to be. You know, once culture is out there, it's for everybody. It's for human beings. You know, it does not. There's race. You know, only maybe can be talked about in terms of its origin. But after it's been released, that's it. You know, it belongs to everybody in the whole world. You know, but at the moment now, with identity politics, what we're having now is this wave of kind of criticism against kind of cultural appropriation, which to me it's kind of again it's kind of trivializes kind of racism, because a lot of people are actually saying that, you know, if they point to someone being, you know, appropriating somebody's culture, they're saying that they're being disrespectful on the one hand to black people, and on the other hand that in itself is somehow a form of racism in and of itself. So it's kind of almost becoming kind of you know, code word for calling someone out, calling them a racist, you know, whether they realise it or not. And for me, it's become the key of looking at how insidious, you know, kind of viewing the world through the prism of the glasses of race has become. Because I think for me, it was when this braid bar opened up. It sells this braid bar as a shop that opened up in Selfridges last year.
Right,
and it had
this one. I can imagine.
It had two, sort of white girls. It had Kate Moss's daughter, and it had Joe Strummer's daughter from The Clash.
Yeah.
They're both kind of like 11, 12 years old, and they had them on the picture advertising the braid bar at Selfridges. Very well-to-do kind of shop up in Oxford Street, and the Radio 1 DJ, whose name I can't remember, she on her show, she was outraged. How could they do this? These two white girls, they're appropriating, black culture. They're basically stealing, black culture and ideas. They're virtually racist. And for me, that was the most, because everyone picked it up. The Daily Mail picked it up. All the newspapers picked up on it. Then Teen Vogue kind of weighed in on it with a big article, and for me that kind of represented the lowest point of this whole kind of anti-cultural appropriation. It was, what we're talking about here, two kind of 11, 12-year-old girls are being thrown into the limelight. But we're talking about cultural appropriation, me and you, who's had a background of his, sort of dealing with politics, but cultural appropriation is barely kind of known. Generally, obviously, it's more widely known. But these two girls would have had no idea what they were getting into, and to focus these two young girls, I thought, into an area which which could potentially
it's bullying on the nastiest sort of thing. Exactly.
And I just felt, I just felt this is bad. This is really, really bad. If you're going to criticise people for cultural appropriation, criticise anyone who's 18 and over, anyone who could probably stand up for themselves, but not two girls who all they're looking at is that they got cool haircuts. They got cool braids. Don't worry, it's only going to be in for the weekend, and that's it. Cause,
and if they'd gone to Jamaica on holiday, then locals would have happily braided their hair for a couple of dollars on the beach, and
exactly.
it would have been
or Africa, and on the African coast it's quite popular as well to get your hair
there are
braided.
So many layers to this, because why do black people own braids anyway?
Truth is they don't.
No, they don't. Probably appropriated them from somewhere else at some point. And
humans have been doing it for kind of as far as we know, as long as humans have been doing it.
And then even if black people had invented, and there's plenty that black culture has invented, how the hell does it give a black person the right to police the behaviour of a white person? This is their hair, it's not.
Well, that's the problem with me, because for me it focused my ideas of why the critics of cultural appropriation are so wrong, because in order to even view this advert for the braid bar in the way that they did, they would have to abandon Martin Luther King's sort of great kind of idea that we don't judge people by the colour of their skin. We judge them by the content of their character. They would have to abandon that idea in order to come to the conclusion that these people were actually being racist in any way, shape or form. For me, I think it's not kind of a principle, but in a way that one concept, that one idea from Martin Luther King, is kind of an unwritten kind of principle.
It's a principle.
It's not. It should be
liberalism.
should be written in stone in the same way as the American Constitution.
It's an absolute solid principle of liberalism, and this equality equality means both sides. Equality doesn't mean one side.
Yeah,
By
exactly.
definition, it means both sides. And
But for me, it kind of highlights how critics of cultural appropriation view the world. They throw these kind of equality issues out of the way. In fact, the last thing on their mind is equality and freedom. Those are the last things on their mind when they criticise anybody for cultural appropriation.
I think it appeals to exactly the mindset they used to join the National Front. Like there's a vulnerable group. I'm gonna kick their faces.
Well, I was debating with Afua Hirsch that one of Little Mink's again was she had dreads for this shoot on one of her videos.
She got attacked for that.
Yeah, and this is picked up in all the newspapers. She got so kind of bombarded with all this kind of hate about what she was doing, about her hair, and that she was apparently stealing black people's culture and all this. That she had to back away from kind of social media for like 48 hours because it really got to her.
It's a mob. And the mob's ready to attack someone.
But for me, it was kind of that is where this kind of whole debate about cultural appropriation seems to be going now. It's a way again. It's like this the success now of this call out culture, and which ends up being a Twitter mob and a Twitter storm, and it is basically to kind of to win more power, to be more kind of influential when you have no kind of justification really for being in that position in the first place. And as you were saying, with this kind of idea that you're kind of almost what I was going to say to Afua Hirsch when I debated her about this was that if Nick Griffins for the BNP was here, I'm sure he'd be quite happy with what Afua is saying.
It's segregationism. The far right and the
exactly. If Nick Griffin was sat there saying, DA haircuts is really only meant for like white people, blah blah blah, we should quite rightly have a go at him and say,
he would agree with
you're talking
because far right racists hate white people copying black fashion. That's what it was true in Louisiana, and it's true of Nick Griffin today, I'm sure.
Exactly, and I think they kind of in the same way, the critics of cultural appropriation almost mirror some of those arguments to do with identity that was put forward by the racists of the past. And I think for me, that's what really kind of the fact that people don't actually not many people actually seem to see that. A lot of people do see that. They think, hold on a minute,
I call them neo-segregationists. That's my term.
They are, and they almost think that, everything should be done along as sort of a segregationist line, and that sort of black people should have kind of be treated preferentially throughout society and culturally as well. That that somehow sort of black people should have or be treated preferentially to anybody else within society, rather than to be treated equally. When it comes to cultural appropriation, the last thing that is really on these people's minds is equality and freedom.
And the last thing is also, they don't give a shit about the cultures they claim to be defending, because if people who know about cultures understand that they come from a complex, mixed origin. I mean, one example is there was this reggae concert in California banned because most of the DJs were white. So what happened was there was a reggae I'm in the reggae scene. Reggae's been a mostly white thing for a long time. It wasn't in the 80s, but it is now. And it was at a university, and it was a coalition of black and Latino students decided that this reggae concert couldn't go ahead because most of the DJs playing were white, and they felt that their culture was being appropriated. And there are so many layers of stupidity. Like, it wasn't Jamaican students, it was black and Latino students.
Madness. And, that's madness. And that's not what reggae is all about.
But these people, if they knew the first thing about reggae, would know that. So they don't give a shit about the culture that they're defending, and they're not defending it anyway because they're not. They had a reggae concert closed down, so they don't give a fuck about reggae. They give a fuck about bullying, and it's a good excuse to go and
endowing themselves with influence and power.
It is power,
which they don't deserve, And I think it kind of touches on this whole idea of the Eurocentric curriculum, which seems to be kind of running side by side with this debate about cultural appropriation. We want to decolonize the curriculum. We want to oppose Eurocentric curriculum. It's just like, hello, mate. If you want to do economics, you can't really do it without studying Adam Smith and sort of Karl Marx and
someone will try, and the scary thing is in this culture someone will try and write and create a black economics, or more likely feminist economics course or something.
It's not
and then
but this is what is meant by kind of culturally ghettoizing everything, which is like, which is, for me, it's the opposite of universalism, and the idea that once the idea is out there, it's for everybody. There's no colour, there's no sex, there's no gender to it. It's an idea that should be, either embraced or rejected, on its own merits. But for me, this whole notion of sort of wanting to decolonize the curriculum is more in line for me to the way people, critics of cultural appropriation, are thinking, because they want to kind of they want to do economics, they want to do philosophy, but they just want to push all the dead white or stale males to one side.
We're going to boycott this economics course because there aren't enough. We're not studying enough black economists.
Exactly. But for me, that's just such a backward idea of education as well. For me, especially if you want to be educated as well in Western societies, you're going to really need to have these, the writings of these, philosophers, economists, and sociologists, no matter what colour they are, in order to, become, a fully rounded thinker for yourself in the future. I think anybody who, suggests that somehow we should push, sort of white, kind of stale male thinkers to one side and just concentrate on, sort of economists or sort of academics that are only of a black variety. I really think they're doing kind of a disservice to black people.
I think massively. I grew up in Brent, which was almost the birthplace of political correctness in the UK. Brent Council made some horrible mistakes, and the Brent Labour Party, because they decided to appoint black and Asian people all over the place, regardless of their qualifications, and that's still being unpicked. And the worst of all was in schools where they appointed black kind of head teachers and stuff who weren't up to the job, because they thought that an incompetent black head teacher would do a better job for black students than a competent white head teacher. It's racist, but as you say, it does a disservice to black children.
Shoehorning people in just because of their colour of their skin, sort of setting them up to fail. That's what they end up doing when they do things like that. But I think things like that they do need to be called out, definitely. But it does seem in this day and age seem to be less and less people willing to do that, and that's why we seem to be in a lot of the predicaments that we see today.
It worries me where we're going, because I've got mixed race kids and a grown up mixed race son as well, but it's like we're in the kind of environment today where almost my kids are going to be brought up to be told they're oppressed, and I just feel like if anyone teaches my kids that they're oppressed, they're going to get a smack, because it's like I want my kids to succeed. I don't want you to teach them to fail, and
this victim ideology.
It's nonsense.
Yeah, exactly. The same. My wife's Irish as well, and so my son's gonna have mixed heritage. He goes to Ireland. He's got his hurley stick, and he comes back to London, and he's got the whole kind of South London thing where he, excuse me, where he'll we'll go shopping. He'll hear Spanish voices because there's a big Spanish community up in Elephant and Castle now, and he'll hear Africans. He'll hear different languages from people from Poland, Eastern Europeans, because there's loads of builders and that in the area now. So for him, we've got the Romanians across the road, and their baby who he loves going across the road, and so this kind of thing for him is just a natural. It's kind of a given, and the whole idea that he might be oppressed in some way, I would hope would strike him as being kind of alien.
You're either going to teach. They're either going to take the children of colour, which I hate that.
I know,
but they're going to
hate being called.
They're going to take them aside and tell them they're oppressed, and even worse, they're going to take their white mates aside and tell them that they're privileged, and you need to then treat these people extra nicely. I don't, I want them to be.
Yeah, the future doesn't really bode well on that
attack on equality and on just and it's sad. I think I could almost imagine this is how it was in, say, South Africa a century ago, which ended up in apartheid, because apartheid is like the logical conclusion, and and it could happen. It does worry me, because Cape Town was one of the most mixed places on earth, and they segregated it. Segregated it for people's own good, and that's kind of it. Just sometimes I just keep shaking my head and looking at the left has become everything I hated about the right. This identity left.
Yeah, I'm a staunch enemy these days of identitarians, and I think I made the right choice when I kind of, took sides in all this. I think I've definitely made the right choice, and I'm just going to continue to criticise the madness that I see coming from that side of politics today.
Yeah, we've talked for a long time. It would be definitely good to do a follow-up to this, but I think it's
very good.
Time to close it. But Courtney, thanks very much.
Thank you.